Today we're going to talk about the state. The state is an interesting entity. The state has terrific potential. When the sun's shining, it can create order and security through things like the courts, the police. You dial 911, fire and rescue come. The prisons to keep the bad guys off the streets. The state can facilitate economic relations, can create roads, bridges, education, communications networks. It can facilitate personal interactions. Think about what the educational system does. It inducts people into a broad set of societal norms. Say please and thank you. Cough into your elbow. Right? Don't make me sick. The state can create a safety net. It can create a minimal living standard. Things like food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare and Medicaid, these sorts of things, Social Security. But when the storm clouds move in, and here is the state of the states, the state can also destroy everything that it can build. It can destroy order. It can break down the state in the name of building another one, or simply to maintain obedience to the only power structures that exist. A government can use the state to disrupt economic relations, from not maintaining the roads to simply taking control of people's property. The state can disrupt personal interactions. You can use education to create cleavages, allegiances to the top only. Right? Separate people from within society from one another and make sure that they only obey people at the top. You can infiltrate society. Destroy any societal safety net. Right? Put a working father into prison to increase the benefit of loyalty to the state. Right? If no one else is supporting me, then I need the state that much more. So today we're going to discuss the origins of the state and modern definitions of statehood. The reason I've got the state of the states up here right now is that there are a large number of states that we could classify as rather threatening than beneficial to society at large. And so the state of the states, if you look, the red states are going to be those that are the weakest. The orange states are somewhere in between, and then the yellow and green states are going to be the strongest states in terms of actually being able to provide for the safety and security of their population. Now, when we talk about weak states, we can talk about those that are threatened with failure. They've got critical gaps in one of four areas: physical security, legitimate political institutions, economic management, and social welfare. Pause here because the dog's crying. So back to the state of the states. Weak states are dangerous because they are susceptible to corruption. At the same time, they provide easy access to the financial and logistical infrastructure of the global economy, including communications technology, transportation, and banking services. Failed states. A failed state is one where you have enduring violence against the government in the name of demands for power. So the weak states that I mentioned before can turn into failed states. Okay? And these are characterized by a lack of physical control over their territory. So when we talk about a strong state, we're talking about a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within the state. We're also talking about an erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, an inability to provide reasonable public services, what people should expect to get from the state, and an inability to interact with other states as a full member of the international community. State failure can be defined along a large number of variables, and I took an index from Foreign Policy, the publication, and some of these components include, for example, criminalization or delegitimization of the state, deterioration of public services, right, where you create groups to provide education. Not you, the society creates groups to provide for things like education, to provide for things like electricity. Go find the guy who will hook up the wires. Sewage and sanitation might be lacking, which leads to health problems. The poor state of medicine, high levels of preventable deaths. All these deterioration of public services is a marker of a failing or failed state. Widespread violation of human rights, a lack of personal security, intervention of external actors, so a lack of sovereignty when people can cross your borders. And the list goes on. So according to these criteria, we can talk about failed states like Somalia, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Iraq. These are among the four weakest states in the world. Right? Of course, Iraq and Afghanistan have changed radically with the military occupation there. So now we're going to look at one of them, Somalia. Somalia is on the east coast of Africa, and the picture that you see here is circa independence in 1960. At that point, Somalia was a showcase of post-colonial democracy. This was not a weak state. It was not a failed state. It was a strong state, relatively strong state. You had double-digit economic growth throughout the 1960s, but you also had the persistence of clan politics at local levels. This became a threat to the central state. In 1969, the president was assassinated, and the military launched a coup. President Barre, who you can see on this picture here, ruled from 1970 to 1991, strongman. This was a time of relative stability, but dictatorship. The economy was stagnant, eventually contracting, and eventually Barre was overthrown by opposing clans. And here you've got the clan structure within Somalia. Clan leaders engaged in a civil war throughout the 1990s, and they couldn't agree on a ruler until 2000, when a very weak transitional government was set up. In 2004, they agreed to create a parliament that would appoint a new president. There's no single leadership capable of countering the devolutionary trends. Clan leaders fighting for power on their own turf, on their own terrain, in their own regions. You had the rise of Islamist forces, which led to an incursion by outside actors, another symbol of another sign and symptom of a very weak state. Ethiopia came in 2006, and they backed the interim administration. But then about a year or two, about 4 or 5 years later, the Ethiopians backed out, and then you had more gains by the Islamists. In reality, Somalia is a country that lacks authority. You've got famine, a history of famine and disease and fighting that have left up to 1 million people dead since 1991. Life expectancy in Somalia is 49 years. Infant mortality rate, 11%. So, how do people exist in a place like this? Well, it's overwhelmingly agricultural, only about 10% industrial. Only 2% of the land, though, is actually arable. The GDP per capita is $600. Food aid is something that people rely on. But it's dangerous, and you've had aid fatigue. We've seen that in other weak states as well. Afghanistan, Iraq, Darfur, Somalia, and other failed states that are seen as a lost cause. There are also lots of other problems with food aid. It distorts the economy so that local farmers don't want to produce anymore. So you've got a malnutrition rate of 19% in some areas of Somalia. But few care anymore. You don't have a lot of aid going into Somalia like the way you used to. Compare this with 15% malnutrition in Darfur. So it's actually worse in Somalia. You also have money transfers from Somalis who are living abroad. And perhaps the most important thing, and something that really highlights the nature of failed or very weak states, is that people turn their allegiance to the local warlord. They engage in clientelistic relations, where they support the local warlord in return for favors. Favors may be as simple as rice. Before we even get into the state expansion and all this, there are lots of reasons why we should care about this. I'll go back to a picture. There's a normative dimension. We can talk about massive deaths. Again, I mentioned some numbers. There's immediate cross-border instability. Think about what this means for Ethiopia. In July of 2009, for example, Somali gunmen kidnapped 3 foreign aid workers in a raid on a Kenyan border town, and then they went back over the border. There's, of course, global instability. Piracy is a major threat. Piracy coming from Somalia. The reason pirates are based in Somalia is because it's a lawless state. Okay, and pirates have been active there since 1991 when the Civil War began. They attacked more than 20 ships in the last year, including 2 carrying UN food. Other aspects of global instability, terrorism. The lack of a functioning central government means Somalia's borders can be crossed without visas. And once inside the country, you can do what you want. There are reports that Somalia is home to Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda cell responsible for the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya. Other aspects of global instability, diseases can incubate in poor countries with broken healthcare systems, and then those diseases come to us. Bad neighbors are bad for me. They can lead to the undermining of a stronger state over time. Okay. Smuggling, think about smuggling. It decreases government revenues. It can bring in bad things like drugs, organized crime. So all of these things make failed states undesirable. It's not just that we care about the people within the states, but we care about the impact they're going to have on states around them and around the world. So how do we understand what's happened in Somalia? By understanding what makes a state in the first place, what makes for a strong state. In other words, we need for places like Somalia to be triaged. Look at the ABCs. What is the purpose of the state? Go back to the basics. And then how can we rebuild it? Today I'm going to talk about the state. I'll look at the origins of the state, and I'll talk about a few primary aspects of state functions: external protection, internal protection, a regulation of intersocietal relations. So we start with, I'm going to actually take a quick break after this, but we start with the origins of the state. So if you look at the picture on the left, we were basically way back when we were a bunch of hunters and gatherers, and we were out there. We organized into groups, but we did it for protection. We've long needed external protection, right? You got the mastodons or whatever they are out there being chased by guys with torches. But the nature of the external threat has changed over time. So during this early hunter-gatherer stage, maybe we were going after the dinosaurs or whoever we were going after. Probably wasn't dinosaurs. But then as things change, as people come together and find and adapt to more sedentary conditions, territory becomes more important. Okay, so people, if you look at the picture on the right, people have begun to farm. And at that point, they need to protect their territory. It's not that they just need to protect themselves, but they actually need to protect terrain, and because the terrain takes on value. Now we evolve further, and here we've got a picture of the town trade settlements. As people come together in larger and larger pieces and create towns, there's more room for specialization. Society undergoes a fundamental transformation. So I might provide for food. Right? I might grow some potatoes, and the woman over there might provide for, I don't know, she might be a good roof maker, and the guy over there might be good at providing beer or jewelry or some sort of luxury items. And that's great. We all depend on each other to a certain degree. Now the problem is we depend on each other in different ways. Okay? And this leads to increased inequality. My food, your or her roof is probably more important than his bracelets or his necklaces or his beer even. So this leads to increased need for mechanisms to regulate societal relations, because now we need greater internal protection. More riches means more opportunities for theft from within and without. Right? We can talk about external threats as well. So we still have the external threats, but now we have internal threats. Why does he earn more than I do? Why does she earn more than I do? I want a piece of that. Right? I want that iPad. Well, they didn't have iPads in this particular picture. But what is, we need a state at this point which can protect the population from itself. And this raises critical questions about societal relations more generally. What is fair? Who has the right to what? Organizations began to establish themselves in order to regulate these intra-societal relations. They created rules. They began to enforce them. This is the sort of proto-state. They also provided for public goods to facilitate intra- and intersocietal cooperation. Public goods are, and I should have a slide for this, but I don't, they are indivisible, non-excludable benefits. You need to know what public goods are. These are things that cost way too much for individuals to supply on their own. For example, I can't run my own education program, but I can chip in some tax dollars, and if everyone chips in some tax dollars, we can build a school. Okay, so that's a great example of a public good. It's indivisible. In other words, we can't stop anyone from going there. That's non-excludable. We can't stop anyone from going there, and it's indivisible, meaning the fact that my child goes there doesn't take it away from your child, because they can both sit there and listen to the teacher. This brings us to a new question. Why do we obey the state? Or a related question. And we'll take this up in the next portion.